foreign exchange market, and I'm sure that this is only the first of what could be 2 or 3 different videos to go through this material. Now, to be honest, this material is it's pretty complex in the sense that you've got to sit down and think for a minute because there's a lot of stuff going on here. You guys and I are used to thinking about the world in terms of dollars, and most of the world does. I mean, but yeah, there's euros and there are other currencies. But for us, it's pretty much a dollar world. But when we start getting into international business, we're dealing with multiple currencies at any given point in time. Um, and in most cases, that always has to be translated back into dollars. Um, and what that translation looks like, or the amount that looks like, changes actually moment by moment, which is why we have to pay so much attention to this because those changes can turn what was a really good business deal into actually a money loser. So your chapter actually does a really good job of talking about the ins and outs of the impact of currency differences and foreign exchange markets on international business. But I'm going to point out a few things for you, and on these slides, I've tried to highlight the things I think are most important for you to pay attention to. And so think about it this way. Think about so you're traveling somewhere, even on a vacation to a foreign place, international place. A couple summers ago, I went to about a year and a half ago. I went to Russia. I went to Moscow and St. Petersburg. And when you travel to places like that, um, you have to have a good sense of how much your dollar is going to buy, and that's why those things in this chapter, like purchasing power parity, matter. It's not just here's the translation of dollars into rubles, but it's also the translation. Well, it's also the fact that uh, you know something costs so much less in Russia than it does in the United States, or something might cost so much more, a particular thing, regardless of the translation. Like gasoline typically is much more expensive in European markets than it is in the United States, regardless of the rate of exchange. So the other part of that is if you the way to understand and look at the rate of exchange for dollars into euros or dollars into British pounds or dollars into Australian dollars or Canadian dollars or whatever, it's easy to look up. Just Google it. Right, there are a number of up to the minute websites that show the exchange rate for various currencies around the world relative to the dollar. Um, but that's typically not the rate you're going to get in your when you go to exchange your money to go on vacation or whatever. So you're going to pay. So it might be. I'm making up this number. If I'm traveling to China, which I've done a few times, you're it's typically 6 yuan ish, 6 yuan to a dollar. And if it might be, let's say 6.5 yuan to a dollar. That might be the actual exchange rate that the banks use. But when I make that exchange, there's going to be a transaction cost. I'm paying a fee. I'm not buying in volume, et cetera. So I may actually only get 6 yuan to a dollar instead of 6.5 yuan to a dollar. So that's typically how it works, and international businesses have to understand that transaction cost part of it as well. So understanding that exchanging currencies into foreign currencies is a big part of international business. That's where we take off in this particular chapter. Um, so there's a discussion there, of course, about why it's so important, and I've noted that especially number 2 there on this particular slide, you know, that engaging in understanding the exchange markets and using them correctly helps us to mitigate some of the risk. We're going to have some risk, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But that's why we must really, really understand this. So the exchange rate, and people are going to talk a lot about the exchange rate, is just that rate at which one currency is converted into another. And usually it's the rate at which one currency is converted into a dollar or a dollar into that currency. Although there are times when there are non-US dollar related exchanges. The euro is very popular, but most of the international transactions are into US dollars. Oops. Okay. So I pulled this up from today, actually. This is the rates from yesterday, currency exchange rates. You'll see US dollar. So that first row here on the left side, which for some reason didn't populate, it'd say US dollar here, euro here, GBP is Great Britain pound, and then there are a number of others, Australian dollars, etc. For some reason, we've got Indian rupees on here. So the US dollar to itself is, of course, a one-to-one exchange. The US dollar, in terms of the euro, it's going to cost you $1.07 to get a euro, to get 1 euro. Okay, and that's actually pretty good. It means the dollar has gained value. It's appreciated relative to the euro because it used to be about 1.5. Now it's 1.07. Or going the other way, you'll get 92 cents if you exchange a euro. Okay. And you can see how this goes all the way down there. That's typically how these tables work. So that's for you if you're exchanging money to go on a trip, but it's also the kinds of charts that business people are looking at when they're making exchanges. All right. So when are we actually interested in doing this? Spastic mouse here. So we're interested in doing this when we are going to receive payments. We're going to be exporting our goods, and the money that we're going to be getting in exchange for that, somebody's paying us in a different currency. All right. So we're interested in knowing how much that really is, okay, or how much what's the price we should charge given that we're going to have to exchange. What's the price I should charge in euros if I'm going to have to convert that back into dollars later on? Okay, that's very, very important. Okay, and if it's going the other way, if we're paying a foreign company, maybe one of our part suppliers, we have to pay them in euros, or we have to pay them in reals, or we have to pay them in yuan. If we're doing that, then we have to know what that exchange rate is going to be so that we know whether we're getting a good deal or not, whether it's profitable for us. That's what really matters here, et cetera, et cetera. These other ones are not as important. The first two are the critical ones, really, really critical here, okay? The other ones are if we're actually if we're playing in the markets. Not many businesses are engaged in currency speculation, but some people are, and of course some businesses might be as well. All right. So the reason that we do this is because there's 3 types of foreign exchange risk. This is covered very well in your textbook in chapter 10. But pay attention to these 3 things: transaction exposure, translation exposure, and economic exposure. Make sure you understand those. Transaction exposure simply means that we are engaged in some kind of business transaction, and we're exposed, we're vulnerable a little bit, because we might make the deal on day 1 and it might not happen till day 12, and then the payment might not happen till day 30. Over from day 1 to day 12 to day 30, the exchange rate might change, and it might change in a way that means that the deal, the profit we thought we were getting, we're not actually getting. Okay. Because when the deal was made, they agreed to pay us X amount of euros, or X amount of yuan, or X amount of rubles, or X amount of rupees, or X amount of yen for the transaction, for whatever it is they're getting. But at the end of that 30-day period, that amount that they agreed to pay us might not be worth nearly as much. And if we're on a slim margin, especially, that could cost us any profit we might have had. It might be a loss. Translation exposure simply means that if we're doing a lot of business with international components, international elements, it might be that we're sending partially constructed parts to other countries to then have more assembly, more manufacturing done to it, and then it comes back for assembly. Well, we're paying all those workers an amount in their currency. We're having to cost what is happening in the foreign markets and then bring it back, and then and then we're selling it somewhere else, and then we've got a plant in another country and we're paying those workers in their currency. All those things show up on our financial statements. And that translation of what our costs are, what our expenses are, what our revenues are, there's a whole lot of back and forth in terms of different currencies and different exchange rates. So that translation exposure means that as markets fluctuate in terms of exchange rates, when that happens, it might mean that it shows up on our financial statements as a loss, or it might show up in our financial statements as a gain that wasn't really a gain in the first place, et cetera. Because when we do this, we're having to show what it was that we did, how much we banked, how much we booked, how much we're going to show our income and our revenues. We're going to show our expenses, but then when we put it on the financial statements, the exchange rates might have changed, and then we're having to explain what those differences are. This is always exciting. Just got an emergency alert: go home, stay home, travel only for work and essentials, virus spreading in all South Carolina counties. Well, there you go. Now we know. I think that must be our official stay-at-home order. Okay, so transaction exposure based on a single transaction, it could lead to changes in profit or loss. Translation exposure based on a series of ongoing transactions that get accounted for in our financial statements, and whether they were, the amount of the revenues, the amount of the expenses is impacted by changes in exchange rates. Okay. And then economic exposure basically is a strategic issue. Should we continue operating in this market or that market or any market given fluctuations in exchange rates? Should we continue selling in a particular market if their currency is unstable? Should we continue expanding our manufacturing capacity in a particular country if their exchange rate goes through so many fluctuations that it ends up being very problematic for us? So our actual strategy is going to be impacted by exchange rates. And so we have some economic exposure. And in some cases, that exposure is low, and in some cases, it's high. And so we make strategic decisions based on that. So what do we do about that? Basically, you'll see a word at the bottom of this particular slide, which is hedging. And I want to make sure that you're familiar with that phrase, hedging. Hedging basically means we know we've got risk, foreign exchange risk. And given that we're engaging in foreign transactions or international transactions, we know we've got risk. And we know sometimes those risks are going to hurt us. But there's a way of dealing with that risk, and it's called hedging. I want to make sure you take a look at that and you understand it. And the way that we understand that is understanding the difference between the spot exchange rate and the forward exchange rates, because there are some actions we can take, which is called hedging. There are some actions we can take that will help protect us. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to end part one here, and when I start part two, we're going to talk about hedging.